Hey everybody, today I'm going to be covering my Exploud deck for the 2004 format. Now I first posted my Exploud list probably 6 or 7 months ago in the Snowpoint Temple group, and I've continued to work on it a little bit here and there, making changes as the meta kind of dictates on it. Now, I said when I did my 2004 tier list that I thought Exploud was a tier 1 deck, and I still think it's a tier 1 deck. But it's a little different. The matchups are different. The format's a little bit different. But I think the same core concept is the same. And that's essentially you want to use breaking sound as quickly as possible and as often as possible. And the way that I've always described the deck to players is essentially as soon as you get Exploud into play, you're putting your opponent on a clock. And typically that's going to be a 7 or 8 turn clock, where you just spread. Every single turn spread. Don't worry about taking cheap prizes with base control. Don't worry about confusing them with Thunderous Roar. Do not worry about anything your opponent has in play. And I'm speaking very generally now. Obviously, there's going to be situations where this isn't correct, but very generally, you're just don't worry about anything your opponent has in play. As long as they are not one-hit KOing you, you don't care. Your goal is to trade 1 Exploud for 2 breaking sounds. So as long as each Exploud is able to get 2 breaking sounds off, then you're absolutely fine. I also caution using ATM Rock too early, but I'll go into a little bit more detail on that as we get into the deck a bit more. So I think this is probably the best spread deck in 2004. There's some healing in the format, but not a ton. And generally, players have a very hard time playing their decks without filling their bench. I will say I think the better the opponent is at controlling their bench size, controlling their drops, the harder it is to play Exploud. But I think no matter how good the opponent is, it's very, very hard to play around the core strategy of using breaking sound every single turn. So I also want to say that this is a list that I feel is very good, but there's always, I would say, 2 or 3 or 4 different cards that kind of come in and out of the deck, and the deck has never felt 100% perfect to me, just because I feel like no matter what I do with the deck or with the list, I'm either leaving it a little bit inconsistent or I'm leaving out an important tech in certain matchups. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into the video. But starting off here, we play 4 copies of Dunsparce. Dunsparce is just absolutely essential to basically any deck in 2004. If you are, basically, I would say 98% of your decks in 2004 are going to be playing 4 copies of Dunsparce. Just opening Dunsparce and using it to fill your bench, not only is that going to thin out five cards from your deck in a format that has some inconsistency issues, but it's also going to set you up for success getting your Delcatty and Magneton engine going. 4 copies of Wishmer. Now, I think you can make a solid argument for playing the other Wishmer, where it's 50 HP, the first attack is Confusion, and then the second attack is just Tackle for 10. The advantage of the Whale Wishmer is a couple of different things. One, players will double set a lot, and I always tell players, especially in this format, do not double set, don't open 2 Pokemon. There's literally no reason for it. I can't think of a single card in 2004 that punishes you for holding on to a card in your hand on the first turn of the game. If I'm wrong, somebody put it down in the comments below, but I can guarantee you it's not a popular meta card. The other thing is I feel getting that initial 10 damage on board and then that disruption can be very impactful. Even against something like, let's say, a Dunsparce start, where they strike and run, grab 3 basics, and then you force them to switch that Dunsparce back to the bench. Now, most times after the first strike and run, the opponent is not automatically going to switch the Dunsparce back to the bench, and that's because it's not advantageous for them to do that. Usually they'll bring something out they're not ready for, they want to use a second strike and run, they'll have to pay an energy to retreat something. It's just very annoying and very disruptive, especially in those first few turns of the game that you're trying to get set up. It's just so important to try to buy yourself a little bit of time. and I think the Whale one does a little bit better job of that than the Supersonic Flip a Coin for Confusion one. 2 Loudred with Crackling Voice. Flip a Coin if heads on Confusion, solid. Light Punch for 40 is solid. Nothing too solid here, or nothing too super impactful here. It's just 80 hit points. Is pretty solid for a stage 1. Then Exploud. This is, I believe, the first Pokemon that was ever printed with 4 attacks. Maybe, I think there was a Rocket's Mewtwo, but I think that had 3. But this was, I believe, the first Pokemon to be printed with 4 attacks. They're all pretty decent attacks and can be fulfilled using Boost Energy. Breaking Sound is obviously going to be the attack the deck is based around. Base Control, once again, can be very situationally useful if you need to take a knockout on something. Thunderous Voice can also be situationally useful where if the opponent is able to put a big threat active, you're able to use Thunderous Roar, get it to be confused, and then ideally buy yourself some time. And then Hyper Voice, 60 damage for 4 energy is obviously not very good, but the advantage to be honest with you, this in general, and Boost Energy in general, is that you are threatening it. And sometimes the threat is more advantageous than the actual effect. So what I mean by that is if I've got an Exploud X active with an energy and I'm Breaking Sound, I don't even have to commit the Boost Energy to Exploud for my opponent to constantly be thinking, oh man, they're just one boost away from hitting me for 60 and knocking me out. And it forces the opponent to play in a certain way that they would not be forced to play in a different situation. So just constantly having that threat of being able to use base control, Thunderous Roar, Hyper Voice without actually using it can be very, I guess not only does that have a mental aspect on the game, but at the exact same time too, you're creating an advantage without actually doing anything, if that makes sense. Beyond that, just to note, 120 hit points, very solid for this format. And then the double retreat cost is not great, but it's payable if you do need to pay it. But generally, the advice I give for the deck, as I mentioned earlier, is just slam Explods at your opponent, Breaking Sound every single turn, throw Caution to the Wind. If it gets knocked out, who cares? Just keep Breaking Sound every single turn. This deck does play the Delcatty Magneton engine. The Delcatty Magneton engine we've covered pretty much in depth here. Now, a couple of things I do want to note starting off here on the basics. I did opt to play the 50 HP basics, and you've seen me play different variations of the basic forms and different decks. Sometimes are impactful, sometimes it's very important to search out your basic energy, so you play the other skitty. Sometimes if you value the HP a little bit more, I'm going to say it should be almost completely dependent on the meta you're expecting. And the actual overcourse of the game, the 10 HP is not highly impactful outside of playing against spread decks and spread decks that play ATM Rock. So how concerned are you of, let's say, playing against an Exploud deck? How concerned are you of playing against a Blaziken deck that plays ATM Rock, where those constant fire streams and snipe damage can add up and they can be impactful? Now, I'm going to say with this, I did play the Random Spark Magnemite, even though the Exploud essentially does this attack better. There is going to be situations that we could find ourselves in where we are going to want to go ahead and Random Spark. Just if something's 10 shy of being knocked out, maybe we don't have an Exploud in play. Maybe we have an Exploud, but we don't want it to take an attack from the opponent. We're just going to throw Magnemite up there. And then Skitty. We just did the 1 energy tackle for 10. I do think if you're going to go with the 50 HP Skitty, this is the best Skitty. You basically, if attaching more than 1 energy to Skitty or leaving it in the active spot more than 1 turn in a row seems like a great idea, you're probably not in a very good situation in that game. Beyond that, we're playing a game where in a deck where that 10 damage matters dramatically, so being able to get that initial 10 damage on board is huge. Now, I think you can make a lot of different arguments. Play the Thunderwave, Magnemite. I think you can make arguments to split the lines, play 150 HP Skitty, 140 HP Skitty. A ton of different things you can do there. Now, and I'm going to say a lot of it's going to be meta dependent, but I think you can make solid arguments for absolutely any of those lines. Now, I do play a full 2-2 Magneton. I'm going to say that, in my opinion, playing the bumped up Magneton line, playing 2-2 versus 1-1, you notice a pretty big difference in your consistency. I don't hate 1-1, but if part of that line does get prized, you have to play so much more conservatively with your Delcatties. You have to play the game so much differently. And being able to constantly recycle those energy, being able to energy draw every single turn can be highly impactful. So I do like the 2-2 line, but once again, I think you could make an argument for the 1-1 line if you wanted to, if there was two other cards you wanted to play in the deck. I'm just saying, note that will hurt your consistency. 1 Oddish, 1 Blossom. Essentially, this is just to keep those Explouds alive even longer. It can also be a situationally good attack against, say, for example, Gardevoir. The level X is weak to grass. The Swampert EX, the weak to grass. Miracle Powder can just be a really solid attack in general if you're in a pinch and you want to kind of throw a Hail Mary at the opponent. The other thing I want to note is how much of a difference that Heal Dance does make in this deck. So let's say, for example, we're playing against a Blaziken deck. They bring up Blaziken, they go Fire Stream, they hit you for 50, you reduce it to 30. They hit you for 50 again, putting you at 80. You reduce it to 60, they hit you for 50 again. You can put you at 110. So they're going to be 10 shy on knocking you out. On top of that, it helps prevent bench damage from different spread decks. But essentially that Blossom is, if in a lot of matchups, is going to turn a 2-hit KO on an Exploud into a potential 3-hit KO, which is one more Breaking Sound. And if we have our opponent on a 7 or 8 turn clock, that is going to be a monumental difference. I highly recommend playing the Blossom in this deck. Moving into the supporter lineup here, we play 4 Copycat, 4 Stevens. 100% essential, I would say. Almost every single deck in 2004, you guys need to be playing. Everybody should be playing 4 Copycat, 4 Stevens. They are by far the 2 best supporters in the format. I opted to play 3 copies of Oracle. 4 gets a little repetitive, and it combos really well with the Delcatty Magneton engine to essentially search out 2 free cards from the deck, whatever 2 cards you're looking for. I will say I have, Oracle is really good, but it's only good in combination with the Delcatty Magneton engine. I have considered going down to, let's say, 2 Oracle and then playing another supporter in that spot, such as maybe an Underground Expedition, a TV Reporter, something that's a little bit good, a little bit better if I open up with it. I would say right now it would probably be 2 Oracle, and then I would probably add a Desert Shaman to the deck. 2 copies of Pokemon Nurse. I like Pokemon Nurse in the deck because essentially you are attacking with Exploud for a single energy, and Pokemon Nurse completely erases your opponent's last turn, and in some cases, in combination with Blossom, it'll erase the last 2 turns. For essentially discarding 1 energy, and then you can just attach that energy again. Now, something I am going to note in the deck is that we, outside of the Warp Energy, we don't play any Switch, we don't play any Warp Point, and while Pokemon Nurse is very strong, it does not get us out of special conditions, say from a Beedrill deck, or let's say a very common strategy that I found opponents will use against me is if I am, if I get a quick Exploud, I'm going Breaking Sound, they'll try to just sudden flash me with Dunsparce and try to buy some time. And while that might not sound super impactful, if they're able to get a couple of heads with that Dunsparce, because we're not going to be able to immediately deal with that Dunsparce. So it's not like they send up Dunsparce, then we knock it out on the following turn. They're going to sudden flash, and even if they get tails, they can still try to sudden flash again on the following turn. And essentially, if we're putting them on a 7 or 8 turn clock, and then they're able to get a few heads with Dunsparce, that's going to keep that clock count down. It's not going to let me move that clock countdown up 1. It's always going to hold us back, and those couple of turns can be very impactful over the course of a game. So I think you can make an argument for playing Warp Point in the deck. I think you can make an argument for playing Switch in the deck. And I think you can make an argument for playing Brinies in the deck. The reason I didn't play Brinies because Brinies puts a lot more... Brinies puts a lot more... It requires a lot more build-up. So what I mean by that is if we Brinies an Exploud, it's not like we can just... We have to have another Exploud ready on the bench. because that Exploud's back in our hands, so either we got to have like a rare candy, or it's going to be 2 more turns before we're able to get that Exploud back out. And while it's great against stuff like Dunsparce Sudden Flash, do we really want to pick up an Exploud and put it back into our hand just to get out of a special condition? That might be the best play, but it's a very high cost is what I'm saying. If I did end up going with a Brinies version of the deck, and let's say played 2 or 3 copies of Brinies, I would probably play a 3rd Loudred and then drop my rare candy down by 1 to make room for it. But I think generally the best strategy is just Pokemon Nurse. Make those Explouds expendable. Just constantly try to slam them at the opponent. Just have key Pokemon Nurses to remove that damage, and then you're just able to keep Breaking Sound over and over and over again. Like I said, I think meta depending, you can make some solid arguments for Brinies Compassion, but generally Pokemon Nurse is just going to be better. 1 Town Volunteers, make sure we get that 5th Exploud out. We can also burn through our deck quite quickly with Delcatty Magneton, so helps us to make sure we're not going to deck out here. 4 copies of Friend Ball. This is really useful in this deck because almost every single deck in the format is going to play Dunsparce, as we talked about before, for opening. So Friend Ball automatically searches out any part of our Exploud lineup. Also gets our Delcatty lineup, and in a lot of games, it's actually going to search out the Magneton too, because a lot of opposing decks are going to be playing Delcatty Magneton as well. Grass isn't too uncommon, so we can, in certain matchups, search out the Oddish or the Blossom. It's just all around good. I'm going to say in 2004, back in the day in 2004, Friend Ball was very rarely played. And then it went to, Chris Fulop popularized it a little bit by playing 1. I think I started playing 2 in some of my lists, and Zaya was the first one that I saw opt to play 3 in his Blaziken deck. And I think on top of that, it wouldn't surprise me at all if 4 became a standard. Essentially, if you look at a lot of formats since 2004, like 2005, for example, 4 Celio's Network was very common, and stuff like that. So it wouldn't surprise me at all to see Friend Ball kind of follow that and maybe start popping up in 4 copies in a deck a little bit more commonly than it is right now. 4 copies of Rare Candy. Want to get that early Exploud out as early as possible. 2 ATM Rock. And then this is just going to combo so well with the Breaking Sound attack. Essentially, we play 2, and the reason for that is we want to be spreading almost every single turn. The second our opponent plays 2 Rare Candy, I use the first Rock. And if they Rare Candy again, I'll use the second ATM Rock. If they don't go that route, let's say they only use 1 Rare Candy and then they try to evolve through the stage 1 on the other ones, I won't bother using that first ATM Rock until it's advantageous. What I mean by that is maybe I'm taking away a Rare Candy and then I'm knocking out I'm de-evolving a Delcatty Magneton and taking knockouts there. Essentially, you want to use that first ATM Rock to slow your opponent down. The second ATM Rock is the one that should win you the game. Now, if your opponent goes hyper aggressive against you, like I said, then you can use that first ATM Rock. If they take a slower approach against you and they're evolving up through those stage 1s, well, then you don't care as much because they're not putting as much early pressure on you because they're taking a much slower approach to the game, which is in turn going to give you more time to Breaking Sound. Now, I think you can make arguments to play higher copies of ATM Rock. I just opted to use those tech spots elsewhere in the deck. Essentially, just if you play the ATM Rock, if you play him just when it's essential to play him, 2 is going to be absolutely fine for you. I do think 1 isn't enough in the deck, and I think 3 or 4 is probably too many. Now, into the energy lineup here, once again, I think you can make a lot of different arguments. I went with 4 Grass, 4 Lightning. We do play the Magneton engine, so I wanted to I wanted to play different, divide this up here so I would be able to attack with Blossom when need be, and then in other matchups be able to attack with Magneton, especially with Gorbis being so popular in the format. It's not unforeseeable that we might need to attack with Magneton in certain matchups. Now, I do play 3 copies of Warp Point in the deck, or Warp Energy, I'm sorry. This is for a couple of different reasons. One, this is really good against special conditions like the previously mentioned Like if Dunsparce is using Sudden Flash against you, Beedrill is going to be another very common example of Warp Energy being good. The downside is you essentially have to have an Exploud on the bench with an energy to make this a good, strong play. Now, I also think you could make an argument for Brinies and Warp Energy, because then you're getting you can find yourself getting a lot of additional value out of Warp Energy, especially against slower decks like, say, Beedrill, for example. Once again, though, I just think Pokemon Nurse is going to be all-around better unless you're expecting a high amount of Beedrill decks in whatever tournament you're playing in. Lastly, I go with a single copy of Boost Energy. I think you can make arguments to go with a very high count of Boost Energy, like 3 or 4 Boost Energy. I'm going to say, though, the reason I don't like that is because, one, I wanted to keep my energy lineup lower. And what I mean by that is we're basing all of our attacks around a Pokemon that takes 1 energy to attack. So I don't want to play, or I don't need to play 14, 15 energy, especially when we're playing the Magneton. However, I need to make sure that I have enough energy to attack at the start of the game. Opening Dunsparce and then not drawing an energy for the first few turns is a horrible feeling. So I wanted to make sure that I will most likely see an energy in the starting part of the game, and with 4 Grass, 4 Lightning, and 3 Warp, that leaves me with 11 openable energy for myself, and I feel like that's a pretty good number. I did try 9, I tried 10, and I just found myself being energy dry at the start of the game. And even in those games where I was consistently setting up the Delcatty engine or the Magneton, if I wasn't able to find those energies, or especially those basic energies, then I could find myself just dead drawing. Now, the 1 copy of Boost is, I think, a little bit situational, because essentially you don't want to have to boost. You don't want to base control, you don't want Thunderous Roar, you don't want to Hyper Voice, you just want to spread every single turn. However, I acknowledge there might be a turn in the game where you need to deal that additional damage. Maybe you have to come up and Thunderous Roar or something. Maybe you have to take a key knockout with Hyper Voice. But essentially, that's not the game plan you should be going with. You should be spreading every single turn. And generally, I've seen people, if they aren't spreading every single turn, end up losing a game maybe they would have won by trying to just basically slug it out with the opponent. Like, we don't want to slug it out with them. We basically just want to spread, win the game in 1 turn. I mean, they can go up 5 prizes. And I've had those games where my opponent goes up 5 prizes, 1 good rock, and I win. And that's a very satisfying feeling, very satisfying game to play. However, I can also acknowledge, especially in a format where you see Gorbis being very common, it's incredibly strong to be able to Breaking Sound once, get 10 damage on a Gorbis, and then be able to just boost and take a key knockout. I can see arguments for both, but that's why I play 1 copy of Boost Energy. I can also see an argument for playing 4 copies of Warp Energy. The downside being is if Warp Energy is the only card in your hand, and you have a bench, you can't attach it to like an active Exploud or something like that, so it's not going to be good in those situations. And then second of all, we've got to hit these basic energies. While getting a Warp Energy in hand would give us a single energy draw, it's not going to be enough we're not going to be able to get it back on the following turn with Magneton, or that turn with Magneton. We've got to be able to hit these basic energies, and while we do play 8 of them, it's not guaranteed, especially at the start of the game. And I have found this deck, and I haven't really pinpointed down why, but I have found games where I just get some very inconsistent starts, either from being energy drought or not being able to set stuff up. And I've done a lot to try to combat that, with upping my energy count, with adding the 4th friend ball, making sure I got a good solid supporter lineup here, but just something to note about that as well. Now, things that are not in the deck that I would like, first and foremost would be a Desert Shaman. I would like at least 1 Desert Shaman. I could see arguments to play 2 Desert Shaman in the deck even. Something like maybe dropping an Oracle and a Friend Ball and just playing 2 Desert Shaman, giving you a few more draw supporters at the start of the game, help you set up a little bit, but at the exact same time be incredibly advantageous after you use that first ATM Rock. Let's say, for example, we spread 5 times, we Desert Shaman our opponent to a low hand size, and then we ATM Rock, removing their Delcatty Magneton from play. Massive swing turn. That might be a game that we had lost, but will give us a chance to come back in and win that game. I've had Warp Point in the deck. It's come in and out of the deck. Ultimately, I think I dropped it for an additional energy down here. I think you can make some solid arguments for playing Warp Point in the deck, or like I mentioned, even going like 2 Nurse and a Brainy's or something like that. But ultimately, I dropped it for an energy down here. And then lastly, I had a Desert Ruins in the deck. I don't really see a way to play 2 or 3 Desert Ruins in the deck, but a single one was very nice, especially in the Blaziken matchup. The reason I ultimately dropped it is Blaziken seems to be about the only deck in the format that's no longer playing counter stadiums. Most of the Swampert decks I've played against play at least 1 or even 2 counter stadiums, especially with Beedrill being popular. I'm going to think Island Cave is going to be a pretty big play for them. And then I've also noticed that Gardevoir is such a favorable matchup anyways that Desert Ruins really wasn't doing much to swing it. Once again, I'm going to say in that Blaziken matchup, being able to kind of peck away at that Blaziken EX, or even a Rayquaza EX, was very useful for the deck. I do think it hurts your Blaziken matchup probably 10 or maybe even 20% by not playing that single copy of Desert Ruins. Ultimately, I ended up dropping it for the 4th copy of Friend Ball. I just wanted to make sure have that little extra consistency in the opening stages of the game. Other than that, the only other thing that I've really considered for the deck was Ancient Tomb. The reason I opted against that is most of the matchups that Ancient Tomb would be useful in are also matchups that play counter stadiums. Team Magma, for example, usually plays 2 and sometimes even 3 Desert Ruins, and I would have to play 2 and probably 3 Ancient Tomb to counter that, especially if I throw down that first Ancient Tomb, or they know I play Ancient Tomb and they hold their ruins and allow me to play down that first Tomb, and they play 2 counter stadiums, I'd need to play at least 3 Ancient Tomb. Going along with that is every single time they countered the Ancient Tomb with the Desert Ruins, it's probably going to be in an absolutely key turn where they're going to be taking a crucial knockout on an Exploud. So even playing 3 Ancient Tombs, they're still going to get 2 crucial knockouts on Explouds. And it's a matchup where if we trade fairly and they have enough of the like Brainy's and things like that, they might just win a fair matchup even without the fighting weakness. The other one is going to be Swampert. I could see it being very good in the Swampert matchup. Swampert EX would obviously give you a lot of trouble. Once again, though, a lot of the Swampert decks are going to play counter stadiums, and essentially they're just going to hold them until it's a very crucial turn against an Exploud, and then they're just going to throw it down and be taking key knockouts. Generally, I don't think the deck has room to play 2 or 3 Ancient Tomb without devoting a lot of counter spots to it. Without losing a lot of consistency in other areas. I do think the 1 Desert Ruins you can make a solid argument for, but in this list I opted for the 4th Friend Ball. So this is going to be Exploud for 2004. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you're not already, please like and subscribe to the channel. It helps me out a lot. And of course, I hope to see you in the next video.